Reef keeping Q&A, let's do this! Hi, Ken Deeb asks, what is your preferred setup for a new reef tank? Is a skimmer necessary? Which size skimmer is better, over or under? Is a filter stagnated? Hey Ken, I do believe that a skimmer is necessary for Acropora, especially if the tank is pretty young. I like to get a skimmer that is appropriately sized or slightly oversized for my system. As far as filter stocks go, it's definitely not needed. I just like to run one to keep my sump clean. And as far as my setup goes, my preferred setup is what I run now. I will leave the system specs in the description below. And the only difference for new tanks is that I would run UV 24/7 until the tank is mature, and I would run the lights at a lower intensity and lower duration until the tank is mature. And those two things are to prevent dinos. By the way, Ken is an awesome contributor to the channel. Thank you very much, brother. Sangjit Das asks, what do you suggest for stagnant frags to boost their growth? Try increasing the flow or changing how much light it gets. You kind of just have to experiment. In other words, try moving it. Prime Reef asks, what would you choose for a new SPS dominant tank, ATI power module hybrid, or 3 radions with 4 T5s? So if those were my only two choices, I would go with a power module because I'm all about having T5 or metal halide as the main light source, and I like to just use the blue LEDs for supplemental lighting. Neofex asks, 2 questions. People often say high flow. What is high flow in your opinion? And how would a person stepping into the acro world for the first time go about it? When is a good time to start? Where to place them first? That is way more than 2 questions, but I will answer them happily. Here's an example of high flow. As far as acclimating new frags to the system, the main thing is that you have to light acclimate your frags. People don't realize that, they try to go by par. If they buy a frag from me, they go, oh, your colony was at 300 par, so I'm going to just throw the frag in 300 par right away. That is not the way to do it. You have to light acclimate. Generally, I start at 150 to 200 par, and then I'll move it up incrementally by 50 par until I reach the desired par level. And you can easily do that with a frag rack and moving that frag rack up the glass. Tattooed Dancer asks, what is your preferred T5 bulb combination when blue LEDs are supplementing? So for a 4 bulb T5 fixture and a 6 bulb T5 fixture, I can't really give you an answer because I've never really found a combination that I liked. As far as an 8 bulb fixture, what I run now is 4 or 5 Blue Plus, 2 ATI Actinics, and 1 GE 6500 Kelvin. What is your coral QT procedure? So if the coral doesn't, or the frag doesn't look stressed, I take it off the frag plug, I cut it off, and then I dip it in bio-advanced solution for about 12 minutes, and then I'll inspect it. I have my little tool here that I use to inspect it closely. It's a jeweler's eye loupe. Boom. Anyway, so I'll inspect it thoroughly, and then after it's dipped, I will just literally drop the unmounted frag into my quarantine tank in a high flow, low light region. I'll light acclimate it in there. After about 4 days is when I'll re-glue it to a frag plug, and I'll just leave it in there for a couple of months until I'm sure it doesn't have any parasites. So Giovanni Ruiz asks, I have a Radion XR15 G5 Pro over my 17-inch cube, and I noticed that my acros get much lighter on the underside / areas that aren't receiving light. How do I remedy that? T5s and metal halide are out of the question. So you can try increasing flow, see if that helps to those regions or just overall. And the second thing that you can do is sort of increase your nutrients a little bit if they're too low. If your nutrients are high, then don't do this. Also, you can try amino acids. I'd probably try the amino acids and then try to raise my nutrients up a little bit. Obviously, you have to be careful in a tank that small. But if those two things don't work, then you may have to just get a bigger light with more spread, or just get a second light fixture to hit the coral in different areas. Alrighty. Punch HD asks, shortest times that an SPS need to recover their color. I'm not exactly sure what you mean, but if you're talking about like newly acquired frags, generally, frags don't start coloring up, in my experience, until they start growing. So, and that's, usually variable timing. Mariano's Reef and Trip asks, do you think you can make a video about the time and effort dedicated to aquarium like yours? I'll consider it, but generally speaking, I think for one of my tanks, it takes me about 3 hours per week to maintain it. Killer's Reef asks, what does it mean if a certain acro loses its color? In my case, Red Planet doesn't brown or bleach, just becomes dull/pale. I'm not sure what causes that, but again, you can try moving it. Maybe it just needs different light or different flow. Alex Gracian asks, hi Abe, what are your thoughts on carbon dosing, pros/cons in your experience? So I tried Zeovit about 9 years ago. I didn't really stick with it, so I don't know if I can really give it a fair evaluation, but generally speaking for carbon dosing, I don't really see any results that can't be obtained without carbon dosing, unless you are going for that super ultra low nutrient system pastel, super pastel look. I would just avoid it. It sort of adds complexity, which is, usually not good in this hobby. Anthony Rodriguez asks, I'd love a video that gets into what type of flow corals like, direct versus broad flow. So I think it's a couple categories here. It's direct versus indirect flow. That's like one category. And then there's narrow versus broad flow. And then on top of that, you have intensity of flow. That's how I like to think of it. So they're kind of like 3 different categories. But in my opinion, the far majority of Acropora like broad direct flow. And it's the intensity of that broad direct flow that is actually different for the species. For example, Acropora meliopora would like a lot of intensity of that broad direct flow, whereas something like a deep water or smooth skin will like a little less intensity of it. Hey guys, Editing Abe here. I didn't give this question as much attention as it deserves, mainly because I was trying to blow through these questions as quick as possible. There are other modifiers. Another category is degree of randomness. You could have constant versus intermittent, then intermittent can be broken down into regular versus random. Another category is unidirectional versus multidirectional. I don't think that randomness nor directionality are all that important for Acropora health. If anything, increased randomness and multidirectionality may help with better polyp extension. The last thing I want to say is that although I do believe that most Acropora will grow faster in broad direct flow, it's just not practical to have all of your Acropora receiving broad direct flow. In fact, many Acropora in my tank receive indirect flow and they do just fine. Josh the Box asks, have you ever dealt with Acropora pest? If so, how did you treat it? So I had red bugs about 10 years ago, and that was after I obtained some mariculture colonies, so I don't do that anymore. No more mariculture colonies. But I treated it with Interceptor and then they went away. But ever since then, I've had a quarantine tank. I've learned my lesson. I've never had Acropora eating flatworms, and I hope to avoid it for the rest of my life. Migno Family Jaw asks, do you have 2 separate techniques to achieve color and growth? I think it's a good question because you can definitely separate color and growth. I don't. I try to get that sweet spot where everything is good growing and it has good color just overall. And, I like to keep a lot of different Acropora species. But people can definitely separate color and growth. What I mean is, like, some people run high nutrients. And the reason why they like to run high nutrients is because they like their colors with higher nutrients. Like the corals seem to be more rich. But they may not realize that it comes at the expense of growth. There are some species that just don't like high nutrients, in my experience and according to scientific literature. In that case, you've definitely separated color and growth, but me, I just try to find the sweet spot. Kenty's Kicks asks, what's your first experience / reef tank and size? What captured you? So what captured me was the symbiotic relationship between an anemone and a clownfish. That's what got me into saltwater aquariums or reef tanks. My first tank was a 55 gallon, the 4 feet wide, only 13 inches wide and 20 inches tall. The biggest lesson I learned from that tank is like you need to get a tank that is at least wide as it is tall. It just gives you better aquascaping choices, and you know, you kind of just get more out of your light when it's wide. If you could only have 3 SPS, what would they be? Oregon Tort, Pink Floyd, and RR Firecracker? With regard to nitrate and phosphate, have you experienced the ideal for color and growth? No, I just do the heavy in and heavy out. I have a nutrient video if you want to check it out. I'll put a link in the description. Drew Young asks, have you ever purchased high quality live rock or aquaculture live rock? If so, what differences in success have you seen? So in the 2000, I actually started a couple of tanks with ocean extracted live rock. They were Fiji live rock. And you know, you get a lot of filter feeders when you get good live rock. It also comes with probably microbiological diversity. These two things will help you get your tank going faster. You know, you can put corals in earlier, it just becomes mature earlier. But I would say in the long term, considering the long term, because people are equally successful with dry rock, dry rock versus real live rock doesn't really matter. For dry rock to be successful, eventually it's going to take longer, but you just have to seed that rock with, you know, good live rock from an established tank, or maybe some small pieces from the ocean. Even Chaetomorpha comes with some good stuff. I like to do that. And, you know, long term, you are going to be successful with dry rock. Francisco Cavalcante asks, what's your DIY LED combination? So you have to keep in mind that I only use LEDs as supplements, but in the halide tank, each module is 10 royal blue LEDs, 2 violet LEDs, 2 blue, and then 2 warm white LEDs. As far as the T5 tank, the LED strip light that supplements the T5s is pretty much all royal blue. Gochi Demoski says, just live stream your breeding tank 24/7 please, and maybe also your work tank and sump. Okay. And Kari asks, what's your opinion about all the new coral names that are coming out? Is the name game out of hand? So for me, I don't mind the name game so much. To me, it's just an easier way to do it. For example, the alternative is to have some kind of systematic classification like Acropora, Miliopora, ICG, YYG, or something like that, 2021 for the year, and where all the different letters correspond to the different colors like yellow and green, and the first letter is like the ocean it came from, and the second letter is the vendor. Like, that would be nuts. I would just rather say Sunset Miliopora. So to me, it's not the name game that's out of hand, it's actually useful. It's actually the prices that are out of hand, but hey, people are buying them, so I don't know. Tim Brennan asks, can you explain what you look for when changing flow to get them to grow differently? Yeah, I don't really mess. I think I know what you mean, but I don't really mess with a coral when it's growing, especially if it started growing from a frag. I tend to just leave it alone because I want it to keep growing. Igor Machado asks, how do you acclimate new frags to your lighting? I talked about this a little earlier. Start at 150 to 200, put them on a frag rack, move them up incrementally, about 50 par at a time. If they start getting lighter on you, then you just move the frag rack down. How do you know if your frag is suffering from photoinhibition? So photoinhibition is a physiologic process, but sometimes it goes with bleaching. Most Acropora will do well between 250 and 350 par, and if that piece is getting way higher than 350 par and it's not growing, and if it's even getting lighter, then it might be suffering from photoinhibition. Obviously you would lower it. But if the frag is only getting like 250 par and it's not growing, or just say 200 and it's not growing, well, it's probably not photoinhibition. You probably have to raise it up or give it more flow. Eric Shingobi asks, have you ever had Acropora frags green out? If so, what are the causes that you were able to attribute to this? So yeah, I actually occasionally have some frags green out on me. This happened more when I had a cheap LED fixture over my frag tank, but ever since switching that LED fixture out, it's been happening a lot less. And it should go away as the frag starts growing. I wouldn't get too crazy about it, or you can move it again. Brother Gas asks, what's your schedule for your reef breeder light? So remember that it's a supplemental light, so I don't really think it's that important, but I generally run 100% royal blue and violet for the whole 12-hour photo period, and then whites are on for 20% for like 6 hours, and then red and green are like 5% for like 4 hours or something like that. Also define swings, parameter swings, especially on things you want to keep stable. Generally for alkalinity, people say that you shouldn't let it change more than 1 DKH per 24 hours. And that's probably most important when correcting your alkalinity, right? Like if your alk is low, you don't want to just dump in a boatload of alk at once. That's like the worst ever. And the reason why you want to be more careful when correcting is because if it were to drop naturally, it usually drops slowly, right? I think it's when people try to correct or overcorrect or freak out and correct too fast is when people have problems. But yeah, generally 1 DKH. As far as temperature goes, temperature swings, I know some reefers who let their tank swing like 3 or 4 degrees Fahrenheit during the extreme seasons. I personally don't like to do that. I keep mine around 79.0 to 80.0. And yeah. Wilmer June Rung asks, the refugium that is DIY, is it okay to use any random black container? Can you show how to plumb it? I don't really understand the Uniseal portion. So yeah, any random black container, as long as it's durable and it's, you know, a safe plastic to use. As far as Uniseals go, I'll put a link in the description of a good Uniseal video, but it's pretty straightforward. Coral Achilles Tang asks, potassium chloride as AEFW treatment, and then gives a video link. So, you know, this is not the first time that I heard of somebody who has a miracle or a cure or treatment for AEFW, and I'm definitely not hating. I definitely applaud their effort, but I've just heard it so many times. Until there's like widespread efficacy, it's proven by a lot of people, I just ignore those type of things. But when that happens, when or if that happens, I'll hear about it eventually. So Murphy's Aquatics asks, what's up, Murphy? Do you use any colors program? What do you dose to your tank? I know everyone has a little something special going on, like I hear about people running KZ, flatworm stop. Okay, so I don't have anything special going on. I promise everything that I do has been said in one video or another. The only thing that I dose right now is 2 drops of Lugol's iodine in each tank. There's nothing else. You know, for me, I don't really jump onto these bandwagons or these trends. I'm just content with simplicity, and I'm content with the results that I get from simplicity. So there it is, brother. Sydney asks, fastest growing Acropora you have, hardiest Acropora you think you have. Bali Green Slimer for both questions. Reef Pizza asks, why Acropora can't live in a new system from day 0, also if the light flow stability is perfect. So it's not, you know, it's kind of like an unknown, but it's somewhere along the lines of immature tank, inadequate biological filtration. You know, it's not something you can add with a bottle. It's not something you can test for. It's not something that you can see. You just have to wait it out and, you know, in the beginning, experiment with frags to see how they do. Nelson's Reef asks, best underrated acro. I would say that Red Devil Nasuta is one of the most underrated acros that I have. It doesn't really look that impressive as a small colony, but as it gets bigger, it gets nicer and nicer. Refugium a must for nutrient export instead of other products? I definitely wouldn't call a refugium a must, but it's one of the better ways to nutrient export because it grow, when there are a lot of nutrients, it'll grow faster. When the nutrients are pretty low, it'll grow slower. As far as like a must-have, I would say RowaPhos is a must-have. I run it in all of my tanks, but I don't expect people to buy into that though, because the current narrative out there is that, oh, you don't want to strip phosphates from the aquarium, that's bad. I don't really need to convince people of what I do, but that's what I do. Gills asks, as my colonies mature, I wonder if you can let them touch. Can acros touch other acros? Yeah, for like stony corals that don't like sway around, you can let them touch. They're probably going to kill each other at the point of where they're touching. It's sometimes they just like kind of grow around each other too. But yeah, it's usually not a big deal because it stays localized. Unless you have like a colony going up against a frag, like a colony might just nuke a tiny frag. So, but if they're both colonies, not a huge problem. Viking Reefing asks, do you see the value of keeping every trace element in the correct ranges as per ICP test? Am I missing out on something? I can tell you from recent personal experience, the answer to that is no. I will get into it in another video, but for the last 8 months at least, I've been dosing trace elements because I wanted to try it, and it has done nothing except maybe a little bit of negative, but I'll talk about that later. But no, don't worry about it. And Dari asks, best temp for acro coloration. I like to keep mine at 79.5, as I said earlier. Whether that translates to better color or growth, I don't know. But, you know, I think some people theorize that the higher the temperature, obviously not too high, you know, it speeds up their metabolism. Who knows if that's true? It sounds like it could be true. Best utility fish other than herbivores. So I like to have a wrasse in each of my tanks, usually a 6-line because they're hardy and they're inexpensive. But wrasses are great because, you know, they're little inspectors because they eat Acropora eating flatworms or other parasites. So if I see the wrasse like looking at a coral and it moves on, it doesn't nip at anything, then that's perfect. That's what I like them for. But if I saw a wrasse inspecting a coral and it started nipping at it, then it's like, yo, you better take that colony out and inspect it because it might have some parasites. So that's what I like wrasses for. Effects of activated carbon, good or bad? So I think it's a good question. In my opinion, running carbon too aggressively or too much of it or too much through a reactor is bad. It can be detrimental to Acropora health. It's not really something that I can prove, but if you look around in the message boards, you will actually find other people who feel the same way. My advice is just to run it to clear up your water. That's the only thing I use it for. And then once the water is clear, I would take it out. But yeah, if you're gonna run it 24/7, I suggest running it passively in a media bag sitting in a decently high flow area. How to best battle spirulina outbreaks? Just take it out and make fish food out of it? I don't know. I've never had it, but I would say that's interesting. Maybe your phosphates are high? I don't know how to deal with that. Wet or dry protein skimming? I skim wet. Rad Reef Corals asks, I've struggled with millies and spas. Any advice? So for millies, they just love flow. Give them a lot of broad, or give them high intensity, broad, direct flow. As far as spas go, don't feel bad. A lot of people have trouble with them. I would say that most people who are successful with spas, Acropora spathulatus, have their coral under very or pretty strong par. And the one that I have actually is getting over 550 par directly under a metal halide. So yeah, try that. Have you found any unique traits or difficulties with specific species? Oh yeah, totally. Acropora echinata, you know, like icefire echinata? Every time I try one, it like slowly withers away and dies. I actually have one more piece that I just got, and if this one dies, I quit. Lulu Bihana asks, what additives do you use for your tank besides the big three? As I said earlier, 2 drops of Lugol's iodine in each of my 120 and 140 gallons. That's it. Michael Telly asks, what do you recommend as minimum space between SPS frags? It just depends on what you prefer. You know, if you want big colonies, obviously you would space them out a lot. For me, I generally like to space out frags at least a fist width apart, but it's up to you. Michael Wynn asks, many tanks look like Skittles and people seem to have collectoritis. If you could pick only 5 corals to make the tank look like a real slice of the ocean, what would you... If you look at the ocean or pictures of the ocean, reefs, it's kind of hard. I think it would be hard to replicate that. Yeah, I don't know if I could do it. But if you were to ask me what 5 corals would I pick if I could only have 5, I would do Oregon Tort, Pink Floyd, Sexy Corals Orange Passion, ASD Rainbow Millie, and probably RR Firecracker. If you have an unlimited budget, what would you get for a 6-foot dream tank? I haven't given my dream tank much thought, but it'd probably be somewhere in the range of 400 to 500 gallons. There are two things that I would do differently. Otherwise, it would just be like a bigger scale of what I have now. Maybe it'd be a peninsula tank. But two things I would do differently is that I would probably try to incorporate all three lighting over it. Halides, T5s, and blue LEDs for supplement. The other thing that I would try to incorporate is a surge device. But I would have to figure out how to minimize the bubbles from it, but I think surge devices are pretty cool. Don Henderson asks, what bacterial supplement do you use? I don't use any bacterial products. El Cali Cornejo asks, how do you differentiate Acropora corals? Is it simply a trade eye? So if you're talking about like identifying it by its trade name, like Oregon Tort, that one's kind of easy. But it's kind of difficult. You really just have to know what's out there. If you're talking about identifying a species of Acropora, that is super difficult. There are taxonomists, they do this for a living. Sometimes they can't even agree on coral classifications. And they even look at the coral skeleton to help them. So, us hobbyists are going to have a hard time. Some are easy, like I said, but you kind of just have to, it just comes passed down with it, hey, want to buy this Acropora millipora, and you just stick with it. Nia Tran asks, do you ever experience coral losses or RTN or STN events that affect several SPS colonies? What do you do to combat that? It hasn't happened in a very long time. What I would do is send off an ICP test as much as I can with my test kits, do a large volume water change, and then follow that up with another large volume water change in like 5 to 7 days, and probably do it again in another week. If I was dosing anything crazy like KZ flatworm stop, any snake oils, I would cut them out totally. You really just have to go back to simplicity, and which is often the advice, the best advice that you hear is just remove all the complexity. And it's interesting though, if you thought about it, it's like, if that's the best remedy for, unknown problems, why not just reef like that all the time? Why not just keep it simple all the time? I'm saying, man, keep it simple. Jared and Alex both ask, what's your take on live or dead phytoplankton? I just don't know, man. I don't know. Sometimes I just don't know. I don't know what's happening. Jao Tomas asks, you constantly look for zero nutrient, and even though there is zero phosphate, you keep ROWA online. Don't you get occasional dinos outbreak? What do you do to avoid these known type of problems in ultra low nutrient systems? Peter T also asks a similar question. Oh my God, you guys done went there. As far as my nutrients go, I don't aim for zero. It's just what happens as a consequence of my nutrient import and heavy nutrient import, heavy nutrient export. But as far as like dinos, I don't agree with the premise. Dinos are not caused by low nutrients. I definitely agree that low nutrients is a consequence of dinos, but they don't cause it. But just think about how that doesn't even make sense anyway. Dinos cause low nutrients, but they also sprout up in low nutrients. Doesn't make sense. But let's just ignore that for a second though, and just think about what else needs to be present for dinos to take over. And usually you see dino outbreaks in immature tanks, and it usually occurs in a system that has been disturbed in some way. Even if it was a mature system, a significant disruption to the biology or biological filtration can cause dinos. And so those things need to be present along with strong light. And, if those things aren't present, dinos aren't going to happen regardless of what the nutrient levels are. And I would go so far as to say that in a tank that has strong biological filtration, that is actually protective against dinoflagellates regardless of what your nutrient levels are. Low nutrients does not cause dinoflagellates. It's instability, immaturity, impatience. Those things cause dinoflagellates. Will White asks, What is your preferred way of dosing calc? Also, when you use calc along 2-part, who did the heavy lifting, calc or 2-part? So definitely 2-part was the heavy lifter when dosing calc and 2-part together. But the way that I like to dose calc is with a little DIY calc reactor. I have a cereal box plastic container. It has a flow valve in it, and that flow valve is for replenishing the RODI water. And I have about a 1/2-inch layer of calc water on the bottom of that thing. There is also a power head in this container, which is facing downward towards the calc. And the dosing pump removes liquid from this container. So when that pump is on, it doses a super saturated, potent calc slurry to the tank. And I sometimes do that, or I used to do that, at night to help fight the pH downswing. And when that power head inside the container is off, I can just dose a normal calc solution. And usually I have that power head on connected to my controller that's sort of measuring the pH. Anyway, I don't really recommend that super potent calc slurry if your tank is smaller than 100 gallons, and I don't recommend it if your tank has it's only good for tanks with a super heavy alk and calcium demands. But that's how I dose calc. Well, that looks like the end of it, guys. Thank you so much for submitting your questions, and damn, if you made it this far, wow, thank you. Anyway, I will see you next video, guys. Take care.